9 out of 10 businesses often fail within the first 3 months. So it must be kind of like their starting point isn't as strong, would you say?
You know, a lot of people have been given this mentality that I have to be everywhere for everyone and do everything. And that if I can't do it all, if I'm not national, if I'm not this or if I'm not that, then I'm not either good enough or no one's gonna buy my product or no one's gonna buy my service.
Back with another episode of Ecom Lab. I'm Madison and this is John McClymont, our guest today. So John, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a 20-year operations and logistics guy. Spent my entire career in the supply chain world. I started in obviously B2B, working in the food industry, and went from a supervisor all the way up to national director. Had a few other stints with different companies, and these days I work with e-commerce and retail brands as well as service providers to improve their day-to-day execution, build out new capabilities, and just generally do more with less, I guess.
So John, you emphasize the importance of operations in e-commerce. Can you share a bit about how your journey went and how this value came to be?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to say that I had like some big grandiose reason for it, but it was just sheer survival and simplicity, right? When I started in the industry, I didn't know anything about it. I literally just fell into it. I took it as a job and I didn't really think much more of it at the time. But, you know, being essentially the most junior person in that type of organization, not having any real industry experience, never having had any real exposure to it, you kind of have to quickly develop a way to be like, how do I understand what's happening every day? So that turned into a really fundamental idea that I still use today, which is just that this strong belief that everything is always much simpler than what people want it to be. And you know, when you really embrace that, it helps you just cut through a lot of the noise, and it doesn't leave you feeling like those tasks or those, you know, work efforts or those sales or whatever it happens to be are really that hard. You just kind of like, you know, what are the steps I need to take and how do I get to level 1, then level 2, then level 3, and you just move through it. And, you know, I found throughout my career that just holding on to that has made some really big problems a lot easier to deal with. And it's always made the results much stronger just because of the fact that each individual step along the way got the right kind of attention.
And what would you say would be like your one piece of advice to simplify those operations for an e-commerce business struggling with simplicity in their operations?
Well, the first thing is with anything is just making sure you really understand what it is that you want to do and what is the easiest way that you can get it done, right? Like what is that maximum effective dose with the least amount of effort to get that, you know, sorted out. So you don't necessarily need the most robust systems. You don't need to have the craziest, you know, data capturing mechanisms or whatever, but it's at least making sure that you are getting the right things that you need for the bare essentials of what you need to do every day. And once you get the basics right, and once the basics are operating almost like on an autopilot and you're comfortable and confident with what happens, you know, then you start to make things a little bit more elegant, a little bit more attractive, a little bit more elaborate.
Yeah, so would you say then you would identify those problems first and then from there, that's how you simplify those operations?
I think definitely anytime you're in a situation where if you can't explain what you're doing to someone who'd be like 12 years old,
yeah,
you're probably too complicated. Because realistically, what most of us are doing in the space, even though it can have a lot of nuance, isn't that complicated about what you want to get done. So if you can't really articulate it, I would say that that's your first problem. And anywhere that people will stumble or that they don't get it quickly enough is always an opportunity. Or my absolute favorite, once you're a little bit of a bigger organization, if people no longer know why they're doing something, that could mean that there's a little too much complexity there because they've stopped thinking about it and they just focus on doing a task that they've been asked to do and not really understanding the reason behind it.
For sure. Okay, interesting. So what would you say a lot of businesses do wrong that leads them to failure?
Well, failure is harsh. I think there's probably a lot of opportunity where, you know, people don't get the results that they want, right? And I mean, that doesn't have to mean like, just a pure failure or whatever. I think first and foremost is trying to do too much, right? Especially when you're thinking about e-commerce businesses and you're thinking about trying to get off the ground. A lot of people have been given this mentality that I have to be everywhere for everyone and do everything. And that if I can't do it all, if I'm not national, if I'm not this or if I'm not that, then I'm not either good enough or no one's going to buy my product or no one's going to buy my service. And I think that really is probably the biggest issue that so many people face, is that technology, systems, platforms have made it so easy to access all kinds of different resources. People don't realize how quickly they get overextended. Yeah. And then you end up, it's kind of like over multitasking, right? It's like, you're doing 25 different things, but every one of them is not really going very well. But they're all kind of, you're doing a little bit of all of them. So that is probably one of the most important things. And then the other thing is, I think not enough people are spending time really understanding the closing of like the loop, if that makes sense, right? So I have my product, I have my website, I ship it out, it's shipped and whatever. But then they don't really do that follow through to make sure about, well, how is that experience for the customer? Were they giving good, what kind of feedback would they have? When was the last time that they revisited my website? Like all of these things that focus a little bit more on that full circle experience, because so many people just get locked into sell. And I think that you need to sell, but you want to make sure that every minute that you're investing is getting the maximum out of it, the highest ROI. So I think those are probably two of the biggest things that you see these days more often than not.
Yeah, so you're saying that a lot of them tend to focus more on like one specific part of the loop rather than the entire loop itself.
Yeah, exactly, right? And just making sure that you're having a really quality experience all the way through. Everything that you're doing is working, because the thing is that if it's only partly working or if it's not really rock solid, as you scale and you build more, those problems or that shakiness, like it's not going to self-correct. It's not going to go away. And then as you have more activity, more sales, you're busier, it becomes harder for a lot of people to come back to those fundamentals and come back to the base. So it's always trying to make sure that you're building really strong from the start, because even though that might feel a little bit slower, and often is a little bit slower, you're going to be able to scale then much more quickly down the road.
Okay, yeah, because we had recently heard a statistic that it was like 9 out of 10 businesses often fail within the first 3 months. So it must be kind of like their starting point isn't as strong, would you say?
The starting point's not as strong. I mean, the reality is it's also really tough. Like, you know what I mean? Especially if you're starting a business, like it is hard to get attention. It is hard to kind of capture the hearts and minds of different consumers and stuff like that. And, everyone's an overnight success after 20 years of experience, so to speak, right? Like, everyone loves to hear that final thing that pushed everyone over the line. But the reality is that usually for most people only happens from, years of dedication and hard work and effort, slowly getting to the right point when that opportunity or that tipping point finally fell, that they were ready for it.
What do you think of, so what I've noticed a lot on the internet is especially like people trying to build their personal brand first and then strain that off into a business. Do you think that's kind of a necessity these days to build your personal brand first to then have that audience? Especially if it's for like e-commerce businesses like clothing or that type of thing, like skincare maybe. Just like those types of products, would you say that like that's
yeah, I think it definitely depends on what your product is. I think the more crowded your space, anything that you can do to capture attention. I don't think it has to be just a personal brand, but I mean definitely that brand presence or that brand story and that brand relevance. I think you are seeing more and more though these days with like the rise of sort of like the attention economy and social commerce, that people are looking for authenticity. People are looking for stories. They're looking for that ability to be that person in their group that discovered something, right? So I think a lot of people like that. There's lots of other ways. Obviously, you can still do really well if you're highly optimized with your ads, if you have a really great product, or if you can sort of brute force the market. But the reason why so many people lean on the personal branding is because it's probably the cheapest way, but also one of the most effective, right? It just takes a lot of time and effort though. So it's not that it isn't hard, but it's definitely not. It's something that's far more accessible than spending $200,000 on Facebook ads or Meta ads, I guess they call them.
Yeah,
these
for
days.
sure,
Yeah.
because it's kind of like building that trust already in that
Mm-hmm.
audience. So I guess that would be like a huge value then for e-commerce businesses to gain trust or like have that from their audience.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing it more these days than ever, right? I mean, despite all of the challenging news that's around right now with TikTok, the reality is that it's showing very clearly that the creator economy is here and those creator businesses, right? Walmart, most people don't even know, but Walmart in the US has the Walmart Creator Hub, right? Where they support a lot of this activity. And that is only going to continue to grow as people find new and different ways to connect online, to form these communities, to sort of align with people that they feel are more like themselves. It's a way for people to showcase their own, personality, their own values or whatever. So you're going to get more and more fragmentation in where people buy, because people want to have, I want to buy from this very specific person or this very specific brand, and not just necessarily like big box retailer A, where, everyone else goes for their everyday commoditized stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I have noticed like a lot of people wanting to support those smaller businesses and those businesses like that they trust or brands that they trust, rather than just purchasing off of Amazon or.
Well, I mean, even think about it, right? Like, for example, how many of your friends, or maybe even yourself, like have you found a new product on a platform like TikTok?
Yes, that's honestly like where I find most of the stuff.
Yeah, and you know what? You're not alone. Like honestly, like the younger generations, especially. I mean, you can tell I'm not necessarily there anymore. But I do have younger kids.
You're doing good.
I do have younger kids, but the product discovery now from sort of Gen Z and beyond is almost all social. They want to have those stories. They want to have those personal shares. They want to sort of see these products and people interacting in a very real and authentic way. And that's really cool, because it blows the doors off of access. Like everyone now all of a sudden can be a creator and can have a product and maybe can design their life that way. On the flip side, it's going to add a huge amount of challenge. Like when you're talking about scaling your e-com business or whatever, when it comes to how do you actually get that done, right? You're going to have more people than ever, more products than ever, more choice and variability, but everyone's still going to want to be able to ship it, move it, get it to someone or whatever. But these things have to be somewhere to start, right? So it's a really dynamic and kind of turbulent time. And I think we're going to see more of it in the next 12, 18, 24 months. And I don't think a lot of people are really aware of how disruptive it's going to be.
Yeah. And that kind of also reminded me of like cancel culture, especially on like socials. Like if you're basing your brand off of like yourself and then you get canceled, then your business isn't obviously going to do well. So.
Oh, well, for sure. Like, so I was walking through the store the other day with my daughter. She's 13. Okay. And there's a popular drink brand that was very hyped up at one point, very hyped up, and everybody was trying to get it to the point where, people were finding it on reseller sites for hundreds of dollars a bottle. These days, like they can't sell it. Like no one's really buying it. It's in every store. It's not hard to find. And I just kind of jokingly said to her, I was like, oh look, this is everywhere. I've been hearing that they're having a lot of challenges with it. And like her immediate response was like, oh yeah, that just fell off. And that's also the real danger of like kind of like a social and attention-based economy, is that you're going to get a lot of these really strong and wild peaks. But then all of a sudden they burn out and it's like the next thing. So you're going to get this really strange kind of activity in what's going to become e-com, because you're going to have your, basics, and you're going to have your sort of just regular commoditized stuff. You're going to have, a few really strong brands that have a strong brand presence and connection with their community. Then you're going to get lots of these like heart attack style products that hit the market really quickly, go out in massive waves, and then almost go dormant. So it's gonna be pretty crazy.
Yeah, I definitely agree. On kind of that note, like where we're going in the future with e-commerce and operations, what would you say like AI and automation, like the future of that within e-commerce?
I think probably the biggest opportunity that most e-commerce brands or sort of small companies are going to see is being able to get more from all of the signals that are out there, right? And all of the information. when you look at Amazon or you look at Walmart, you look at any of these people, they're so successful because of the information they have and how well they understand the consumer. I mean, there's a long running joke that, you know, Amazon is the first person to know that a woman is pregnant because her search history changes very quickly. But I think that that's where AI and a lot of these new tools are going to help people, because the biggest challenge I see these days from an operational perspective for someone that's trying to grow is that they went from having no information and no real transparency to having so much information and so much connected data, you don't even know what to do with it. And, you know, the average kind of person has not had the exposure or the experience to all of a sudden sift through, like, you know, different data sets about like what are people buying on what days and this and that and whatever. So I really do think that, you know, helping people get really fine and strategic and surgical with what they're doing is probably one of the biggest opportunities for it. And then secondly, it gives so many brands the access to do things they wouldn't have been able to do. You could have AI agents to act as a customer service department. You could have, you're making sure that people are feeling connected with answering emails. That's not to say that you shouldn't have people, but, you know, it makes it easier to work with a team of 5 rather than 50.
Yeah.
And that's going to make a big difference for a lot of brands.
So I do know, like, especially from kind of what I've seen, is like a lot of people are missing that personalized like messages and like actually talking to a person.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's like a huge issue going on. And how would you say that issue would be resolved with AI, or like what that would look like?
I think that there's a couple of things, right? Like I think that it's having the right solution in the right place for the right situation. And I think that there's definitely circumstances when you want to get through to a person very quickly, because that, especially in a situation that feels more negative, right? Someone had a bad experience, they had a failure, something didn't happen, like they're not in a good, let's call it like emotional space. Like those types of things are great opportunities to have it go to people. But on the flip side, there's a lot of times where the communication engagement's like, I want an update, I have a question, I want to validate or verify something, like things that are not emotionally charged, or that, you know, someone just wants to maybe have a little bit more information about. Those are great avenues to, you know, use some of these technological tools, because they can take care of what someone just wants as a very transactional kind of experience, and focus your effort and focus your people where you're going to have the greatest kind of impact and the greatest connection to a customer.
Yeah, because I feel like there's two sides of it. There's like you're on the phone and you're waiting for like 2 hours, and then you're like getting the same exact message from like an AI bot, like, or a chat bot. So it's like there kind of has to be that balance, I feel like, too. So
for sure. And I mean, you know, that's the other thing too. I think it's important that whenever you're using any kind of technology, like use it yourself. Because before you justify or rationalize, well, this is pretty good, I pay for this, it's good enough, it does this, XYZ brand uses it, none of that really matters. The biggest like litmus test for anything is basically like, if you were the other person and this was happening to you, like if you were the customer, would you be happy with this, yes or no? And most people, most of the time, are like, yeah, this sucks. And if it sucks for you, it's going to suck for everyone else. So like, you know, irrespective of the fact that it might cost you $1,000 or $5,000 a month, if it's not really quality in your experience without rationalizing it, a customer that doesn't have your brand at heart that way is not going to think it's worth it.
Yeah. It's like you have to keep up with the speed, but also like put yourself in your customer's shoes at the same time, and
For
like
sure.
how that would balance. So.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that I do, people are always like, oh, you know, where do you get these crazy ideas and stuff? And it's like, I just, honestly, it's like, it's the things that bug me. It's the things that don't work. Like if I'm a consumer and I'm like, wow, this was really bad. Like I had an experience with a very big designer brand, you know, just picking up a gift. And it was like, it actually allowed me to add the thing to the cart, go all the way to the end of the thing, put in my payment details and hit buy, before it was like, oh, we're out of stock. It's like, that shouldn't happen these days. You know what I mean? And no matter how good that back-end tech is, that was a terrible experience. And whether you're a multi-billion-dollar brand or, you know, you've got your first $1,000 in sales, it's an equally bad experience both ways.
Yeah, and I feel like especially with like the amount of tech and like AI and stuff these days, like that type of stuff like shouldn't happen. So when it does, it's like, it just looks bad on the brand.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why you got to focus on the details and the small things and make sure that all of these things are working properly, because once it gets out of control, it's very hard to fix after.
And so when talking about like outdated stuff as well, like the website and whatever, what outdated practices do you find like a lot of e-commerce businesses doing, and what could they do
Yeah,
to fix those?
I find it's funny because it's probably not outdated just in the sense of like, oh, it's an old practice per se. There's one for sure. If you're printing the shipping label, if you're telling a customer that their product is shipped the second you printed a label, that's very outdated. You need to stop doing that immediately. But that's probably just a pet peeve of mine, like that one there, because I can't believe it still happens. The other thing though is more, I've taken old ideas and I'm using new tech to do it. And I think that that's probably the biggest mistake that people are doing these days when it comes to, like, what's a mistake that people keep repeating is like lazy emails, lazy promotions, like lazy copies, like fake personalization, where you can essentially tell that it's a canned message just with like a mail merge and you're just spitting out different names. Yeah, that might be the newest AI system on the planet that's running that for you, and it made it really easy to do through Slack or whatever else it could be. But the reality is those are bad practices. Those are practices that are well past their prime. And just because of the fact that it's on a new platform or baked into like a more holistic platform that can do 7 different things, it's still a really dated way to try to connect with consumers and your customers. And it comes off extremely unauthentic. And I think that, those are the types of things that you want to eliminate from your business as quickly as you can.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. Like, I notice immediately if it's an AI automated email. Like, and there's different ways I feel like you can utilize like AI instead of just having those automations changing the name. Like, you can now personalize it and like scrape the entire LinkedIn and give them a personalized email answer too. So that's also a forward-thinking way too.
Yeah.
Looking toward 2025, what are top 3 tips you would give to e-commerce businesses to implement like before going into the year, or just in general looking forward into the year?
Yeah, so first and foremost, no matter what you're doing, is kind of get like your information and your data together, right? Like no matter what service provider you're working with in whatever capacity, the better that you can transact information about your product or your services and have all of those details is going to make it way easier for everybody. Probably going to save you a lot of money down the road too, but that's one thing that I think is really important, especially because of the fact that you're having the advent of AI shopping, right? Shopping assistants, right? Perplexity came out with their shopping assistant in the US. You've got Amazon's Rufus and things like that. So the better the quality of your information is going to help you in a whole bunch of ways, operationally, sales, marketing. So that is something that is ultra unsexy and nobody wants to talk about, but very, very important for what's going on these days. And then, the other thing I think is really important is starting to be very mindful about the partners that you're working with, especially understanding the type of business you are. If you are a social first, sort of, let's call it like a TikTok driven or some other kind of social commerce platform or opportunity driven brand, you want to make sure that you're partnering and you're working with people that like live that space, that understand that space and are going to support you in that space. Because, as an example, very traditional like warehouse operations, if someone wants you to fit that mold for that type of sales channel or selling style, that's probably going to be a really hard relationship, because those kind of don't really mix that well. That's not to say the old ideas don't work, but you have to understand the fact that I'm going to have more products, faster turns, faster peaks, valleys, and you want to make sure you're working with the right people for the type of business that you are. And then the other thing that I think is going to become extremely important is how well you penetrate your communities or your regions. And instead of just trying to sell everywhere to everyone, is like, how do I make sure that I'm getting the most out of like everything that I put in, and then I'm pulling the maximum sales out of that city or that region where I'm really popular, or that I'm getting everybody from that type of community that seems to be buying my stuff already. And then strategically kind of be like, well, what's the next thing that makes sense, right? Like, if you're a New York brand, LA might sound really attractive, but Boston is probably a better jump. You know what I mean? For a lot of the ways that you can stack your gains and execute and be far more effective.
Yeah, so it'd be like run those ads in that region, niche down your target audience even more in that region, and then from there kind of go to a similar like area as well. So
yeah, exactly. You'll get there eventually if you're good enough. Like, don't worry about it. But like, the one thing is that you don't want to be making mistakes and you don't want to be sloppy all over the place, because customers unfortunately have just too much choice.
Yeah.
There's too many opportunities
There's
out
too
there.
much
So,
choice.
as much as possible, first time right all the time.
And would you say also like staying on those platforms for those audiences rather than being on every single platform? Because I've heard people also say like you should just be on everything and maybe your audience is on there.
I think it depends though, honestly, like in the sense of being on every platform. I think, if you're going to be really honest about the needs of different platforms, like I think a LinkedIn user is different than a TikTok user, is probably different than someone that really leans on Meta, Facebook, whatever, and then same with Instagram. So I think there's nuance to each one of the platforms. Where I do think you can get some benefit though is on the back end, right? There's a lot of providers these days that can integrate with all of these different shops, that have the ability to manage all these different shops. So at least from an operations and execution perspective, that type of social commerce that you might be doing on Instagram, for example, and maybe Blue Sky, and now TikTok, for example, or whatever, might be the next big thing. Those types of things can still execute in the same way, but you could have a different opportunity if all of a sudden you break through and you fall into retail channels, right? And have a different way that you kind of approach those sales. So I think it's probably more important to make sure that your execution can handle all of the channels. As long as you can be relevant on each one, then that's good. But there are differences. So with only so much time, probably pick the ones where you think your audience is strongest and start there.
Yeah, okay, that's good advice. Another thing I have heard kind of like for future wise where like social media and stuff is going is having like niche specific platforms now. So it's like whatever kind of industry you're in, there's going to be like social medias for that specifically, just because there's so much noise on the internet. I've heard that that's kind of like a prediction as well, which is something interesting to think about too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I saw one yesterday. I was surprised the launch of a new type of, social platform, for a very specific community of people and stuff like that. So, you know what, whether it ends up being separate apps, whether it ends up being better sort of community gates within apps that already exist so that you're only seeing the stuff, like Blue Sky as an example is getting a lot of traction by, saying, hey, your feed your way, and you pick just the, you pick your geography. So like, I shouldn't say geography, but I mean, you pick your communities, you pick what you want to see, and that's what you're going to see, right? So I think it's probably a lot of that you'll see as well. To your point, there's so much content, there's so much information out there, people are going to have to drop some of it. So it is understanding the fact that what do your specific people want and how do you get that customer intimacy so that you're speaking in a really relevant and connected way to those people that you're trying to reach.
So for example, back on the skincare brand topic, let's say they're trying to grow and they're doing about 10 to 100 orders a day. What would be the next steps for them?
Well, I think it's probably important that they start to be honest with themselves and know when they're, the way that got them to where they are, when it starts to become like a hindrance or a barrier for them to grow, right? I think everybody pretty much starts, like, whether it's their basement, their kitchen table, their garage, whatever it is, everyone loves to have that story. But at some point, doing that type of fulfillment and order tracking, whatever, takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and you don't want it to go sloppy. So, is there a specific number for every brand that's the exact same? No. But I think when it starts to feel that like you're having to overextend yourself just to try to get things out the door, you're feeling that you're too inundated by it, that's probably a time that you want to start exploring, well, how do I move this maybe to something that's a little bit more structured, maybe a little bit more professional, like a 3PL partner that will have the ability to warehouse your product, ship it out as those orders come in with those integrations from your stores. The benefit these days is that this is basically like all the rage, right? Is that you're getting a number of 3PLs that are highly focused on growing brands and wanting to bring them in and doing that support, which wasn't there even like 5 years ago, as an example, where no one wanted to get into that business. I mean, I think you guys are even actually doing that. Like you're really supporting new brands. And I think it's far more accessible today than it ever has been. And people are afraid to reach out because they're like, oh my God, I don't have all of this money or whatever. But you want to try to balance the fact of like, you can't afford to have poor customer execution and bad stories going out to the market and having all kinds of customer service issues, because as a growing brand, that word of mouth, like those warm leads are the best thing and the best ROI that you're going to get. So I always encourage people to start looking and being really serious and understanding what it would take and how their business can support it once they start getting to that point that they're feeling that they're overextending themselves, like, and most people start to be able to understand that, hey, I'm having to like burn the midnight oil like 5, 6, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
Like, how long is that sustainable? Because you never want your quality to suffer.
Yeah, and it would be like, at what point do you decide that, okay, this is taking up a lot of my time for my business, that I need some help from someone else, and then you're able to focus on growing your business in the other ends instead of just fulfilling those orders that are coming.
Yeah, for sure. Because honestly, operations is hard, right? Like, people think that just because it's simple that, oh, it's not a big deal to do, but it takes a lot and it never stops. And as you continue to grow, you're going to find it's order after order, day after day, like pack after pack. And it gets really difficult to do. And then, another big mistake people make is that because it's so easy to understand, it's like they just put it off, procrastinate a little bit. And all of a sudden you got this big backlog, this big pile. You're working, 20, 24 hours straight, 30 hours straight just to get stuff out the door. But then what you want to have happen, what you're working towards, is so that happens essentially the next day.
Yeah.
So, you definitely want to try to understand, like, how can you build a business that can incorporate some of this support, because you probably, and the sooner that you can do it, probably the better off you're going to be able to scale and grow long term. And especially if your product takes off, you want to be prepared for it, because trying to do it all yourself is going to be extremely difficult.
For sure. So John, in closing, do you have any final tips or advice for e-commerce businesses?
Yeah, e-commerce is hard. Like, you know what I mean? It is going to be really hard. So I think it's important that you're really focused and specific about what you want to do and why you feel it's an opportunity. Because if your idea or if your product or service is very surface or relatively undifferentiated, it's going to make it that much harder for you to get attention. So I think that the more that you can do to have something that really speaks to people or connects to people in a specific way, the better off you're going to be overall. And then, really track and measure yourself as much as possible. That's probably one of the biggest things. We talked about AI, we've talked about different tools, is try to be as like data informed as you can, right? Because like, you only have so much time, everyone only has so much time. And every hour that you spend maybe with the wrong strategy or going down the wrong path means that it's an hour that you're not investing elsewhere that can help your business. So too many people, I think, fall into this like sunk cost fallacy where I've already put X amount into it, I just got to keep going and try to grind it out. Unfortunately, like pure brute forcing a problem doesn't always work. And it definitely doesn't work when that product market fit isn't there, or if like your messaging is off. So fix the problems that really are showing up or bubbling up. And if you're not getting the right type of engagement, if you're not getting the right type of feedback, if you can't essentially almost give your stuff away with high promos, like, you've got a problem, and no amount of extra time is probably going to fix that. You got to go back, find what that root cause is, and kind of reset. So a lot of test and iterate, test and try, I think, is probably the biggest thing to come away from for anybody.
So in like short form, would you say it's like simplicity, analyzing your data, going back to that, and then growing with technology? Yeah,
like do everything you can to get as much like measurable feedback as quickly as possible. And follow the things that are giving you the right kind of answers, and be pretty quick to get rid of the things that really aren't working, right? Even if you like them, and that's usually the hard ones. People like something, they just keep it up, but everything is telling them that they shouldn't spend that kind of time there.
For sure. Well, thank you, John, for being on this episode today.
Well, thanks for having me. Totally appreciate it.
And that will be the end of this episode of Ecom Lab. Thank you. Subscribe.